Miranda versus Arizona, a court case that guarantees your Fifth Amendment rights. This is where the Miranda rights come from. In 1963, a Mexican immigrant named Ernesto Miranda was arrested for kidnapping and raping a young woman. Miranda confessed to the crime and was found guilty. Miranda appealed the case on the basis that he made his confession without knowing his Fifth Amendment rights, which stated he had a right to a lawyer and not to incriminate himself. The case came before the Supreme Court in 1966, and with a little more than 3 months of deliberation on the matter, in a 5-4 decision, the court ruled in favor of Miranda and overturned his conviction. It declared that criminals must be told their rights guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment, and any evidence obtained from them prior to hearing their rights will have been obtained illegally. So since the evidence was obtained before his rights were given to him, the question arose as to whether or not the evidence of the actual sale should be used in trial. This case set the basic grounds for criminal rights cases today. Marbury versus Madison. Jefferson refused to deliver papers. This court case in early American history gave the judicial branch the power of judicial review. It began on March 2, 1801, when William Marbury was designated as a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. The disgruntled appointees invoked an act of Congress and sued for their jobs in the Supreme Court. The last issue of the Constitution was the fundamental and paramount law of the nation, and that an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void. In other words, when the Constitution, the nation's highest law, conflicts with an act of legislature, that act is invalid. This case establishes the Supreme Court's power of judicial review, which means they can declare whether or not a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. U.S. versus Nixon. The court case that led to Nixon's resignation. President has executive privilege only with national security. A grand jury returned indictments against 7 of President Richard Nixon's closest aides in the Watergate affair. The special prosecutor appointed by Nixon and the defendant sought audio tapes of conversations recorded by Nixon in the Oval Office. Nixon asserted that he was immune from the subpoena, claiming executive privilege, which is the right to withhold information from other government branches to preserve confidential communications within the executive branch or to secure the national interest. The court granted that there was a limited executive privilege in areas of military or diplomatic affairs, but gave preference to the fundamental demands of due process of law and the fair administration of justice. Therefore, the president must obey the subpoena and produce the tapes and documents. Nixon resigned shortly after the release of the tapes because he knew he had lied. This resulted in limiting executive privilege to the president. McCulloch versus Maryland. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second National Bank of the United States. In 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to impose taxes on the bank. James W. McCulloch, the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay the tax. In a unanimous decision, the court held that the Congress had the power to incorporate the bank and that Maryland could not tax instruments of the national government employed in the execution of constitutional powers. This resulted in states cannot tax the federal government. Pugh versus Alabama. Scottsboro boys, 9 black youths, described by their attorneys as ignorant and illiterate, were accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train headed from Chattanooga to Alabama. Alabama officials sprinted through the legal proceedings. A total of 3 trials took place in one day, and all 9 were sentenced to death. Alabama law required the appointment of counsel in capital cases, but the attorneys did not consult with their clients and had done little more than appear to represent them at the trial. The court held that the trials denied due process because the defendants were not given reasonable time and opportunity to secure counsel in their defense. This case was an early example of national constitutional protection in the field of criminal justice. The trials violated the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. This case now guarantees due process of a trial based on 6th and 14th Amendment.
Tinker versus Des Moines, a court case about the First Amendment, freedom of speech. In 1965, students in Des Moines wanted to show their support toward the Vietnam War. Gideon versus Wainwright, a court case that guarantees your Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer in all courts. In 1962, Gideon requested a lawyer but couldn't get one. According to a Florida state law, an attorney may only be appointed to an indigent defendant in capital cases. Reno versus American Civil Liberty Union, a court case that guarantees your freedom of speech on the internet, intended to protect minors from unsuitable internet material. Wallace versus Jaffrey, the state of Alabama cannot force students to say a prayer based on the First Amendment. In 1984, an Alabama law authorized teachers to conduct regular religious prayer in school classrooms. Wyatt versus Stickney. A good example of this is Bryce Hospital. A federal court in Alabama held for the first time for people who are involuntarily committed to state institutions because of mental illness, and that they have the right to treatment and to return to society. One act that came out of this court case was the American Disabilities Act.